Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take stacks of complex documentation, in this case, well, the detailed procedures governing U.S. patent examination, and really give you the shortcut to understanding what matters most.
We've been guiding you through the Manual of Patent Examining Procedure, or MPP, and we've been focused on Chapter 2300. That chapter traditionally covers interference and derivation proceedings.
Which is, the legal battle over who invented something first.
Exactly. It's the ultimate fight for priority in the patent world.
But today, we hit a section that completely shifts the battlefield. We're diving into MPP Section 2309, and this isn't about priority. It's about, well, absolute ownership. Specifically, who owns the invention when these powerful federal agencies like the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, or the Department of Energy are involved.
And this is a deep dive into this really unique procedural bridge that exists between binding federal contracts and the USPTO's patent system. So for you, the learner, we're going to extract the specific, almost hidden rules that say how statutory obligations can automatically vest ownership in the government.
And that can sometimes override the traditional rights of the inventor.
Right, or even the contracting company.
That distinction is so key. I mean, when most people think about IP transfer, they think of an employment contract where an inventor assigns their rights to a company. That's a voluntary agreement.
Yeah.
What we're talking about here with NASA and the DoE, it seems far more absolute.
It is absolute because it relies on federal statute, not just a simple contract clause.
Yeah.
We're moving from private contractual law into, public statutory law. And this authority is codified because of the strategic, sensitive, and often national security implications of the work.
So let's get into that. What's the legal hammer here? Where does the federal government get this extraordinary power to just claim ownership?
The power derives directly from legislation that's specific to their missions. So for NASA, the authority flows from 42 U.S.C. 2457.
Okay.
That's part of the foundational legislation for the agency. And for the Department of Energy, with its history tied to atomic and nuclear tech, the rules are in 42 U.S.C. 2182.
So two separate laws, but the mechanism sounds pretty similar. The government gets a claim on the invention if a key condition is met. What is that crucial trigger?
The trigger is that the invention must have significant utility within the respective operational fields of those agencies. That's the crucial filter.
So it's not just enough that you were paid by a DoE contract.
No, not at all. The subject matter of the invention itself must be deemed essential or, critically important to a national objective covered by their statutory mission.
I think we need to linger on that because significant utility sounds a little abstract,
Yeah.
but has these massive implications for ownership. Can you paint a picture of what this looks like for NASA?
Sure. Think about the core of space exploration. If a private company working under a NASA grant develops a radically new, lightweight composite material that can survive, say, high G-forces and extreme temperatures.
Something that could improve re-entry systems.
Exactly. That has significant utility. Or maybe the innovation is a breakthrough in next-generation spacecraft propulsion, like a novel plasma drive. Because it arises under a contract and is centrally critical to NASA's mission, the government can step in and claim title automatically.
That makes it really clear. It's not about the general utility of the invention on the market. It's about its specialized utility to the federal mission.
Yeah.
And for the Department of Energy, the stakes feel even higher.
Oh, they absolutely are. For the DOE, significant utility often involves incredibly sensitive technology. We might be talking about a new, highly efficient process for enriching or refining special nuclear material, or maybe a system that drastically improves safety protocols inside a nuclear reactor or a waste storage facility. These innovations are critical to national security, so the government needs absolute, transparent control over that IP. That's why they are the obligated assignee right from the start.
That term obligated assignee, that's important. For our listeners who might not be steeped in IP law, what does that mean in this context?
Certainly. So in standard patent law, an assignee is just someone who has been given or has bought the rights to an invention. But if you are an obligated assignee, it means a contract, or in this case a statute, mandates that the rights must be transferred to you the moment the invention is conceived.
I see.
So for NASA or the DOE, their contract language, which is backed by the U.S. Code, ensures that if an invention hits that significant utility threshold, they are immediately the legally entitled owners. This is really just the government exercising stewardship.
So we have the legal hammer, this statutory automatic vesting. But how does the USPTO fit this square peg ownership into the round hole of its priority dispute rulebook? That's where the procedure in MPP 2309 comes in.
That is the essential procedural challenge. Chapter 2300 is designed for interferences, which is a formal adversarial trial to figure out who conceived an idea first.
Right.
But when NASA or the DOE claims ownership, the question isn't who invented it. The question is, does the government's statutory claim even apply here?
So how does the system adapt? We know the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, the PT, handles these disputes.
Yes. And the PT resolves these ownership questions using what the MPP calls interference-like procedures.
Yeah.
Think of it this way. They're borrowing the formal trial-like framework that the USPTO uses for priority disputes, and they're retrofitting it for a title dispute.
Interference-like. That implies they take the structure, but they modify the substance. What parts do they borrow from a traditional interference?
They borrow the rigorous adversarial chassis. Traditional interferences involve, sworn testimony, defined motion periods, presenting evidence, discovery, all to establish facts like dates of conception.
Okay.
When dealing with a NASA ownership claim, the PTAB uses that same structure. Formal motions, responses, sworn evidence, but the evidence isn't about priority dates.
Instead, the evidence is focused on the contract itself. Was the invention actually conceived under the contract? Does it relate to the scope of work? And crucially, does it meet that significant utility threshold?
Precisely. They use the procedural rigor of an interference, which is designed for these complex, high-stakes factual disputes to resolve the dispute over title. It provides a consistent, fair, and legally sound method, even though the core question is fundamentally different.
And this also involves the PTAB immediately taking control over the file, which just underscores how serious a government ownership claim is. Our sources note that the board acquires jurisdiction over the involved file as soon as a contested case begins.
That rule is crucial. Once a contested case starts, the board assumes jurisdiction. This effectively puts the normal patent examination process on an immediate hold.
So the examiner can't do anything.
Nothing. No allowance, no rejection, until the PTAB resolves who actually holds the title. It stops the clock and forces a resolution of that foundational ownership question first.
That makes perfect sense. You can't grant a patent until you know who the legal recipient should be.
Okay, let's shift to the responsibilities of the parties, starting with the inventor or the applicant. What is their specific duty here?
Inventor accountability is paramount. If an applicant files an invention that might relate to a government contract under these acts, they are legally required to submit a highly detailed statement. This isn't optional. It's a required disclosure.
And what does that statement have to detail?
It has to describe the precise circumstances of conception. It must explicitly state the dates, the location, the funding source, and critically, how the conception relates to the relevant federal contract. So if the contract was for advanced thermal shielding, the statement has to show how this new ceramic coating was conceived using resources from that contract.
Exactly, using the equipment, funding, or data generated under that specific contract.
And what happens if an applicant fails to disclose this, or maybe misrepresents the situation to try and avoid the government's claim?
The consequences are severe. Failure to disclose or a false statement can lead to the patent being deemed unenforceable down the road, even if it was granted. The USPTO and the agencies treat this disclosure as fundamental. It's an ethical and a legal obligation.
Okay, so the USPTO examiner gets this application and this detailed statement. The application is now flagged. How does the examiner, who might be an expert in, say, electrical engineering but not federal contract law, proceed?
This is where the specialized internal coordination comes in. It really shows how seriously the USPTO treats these claims. The regular examiner does not handle this alone. First, they are specifically instructed to coordinate with the Office of Licensing and Review within the USPTO.
And what's their role?
Their job is essentially to act as the compliance arm. They review the contract clauses, they assess the scope of work, and they compare that against the applicant's statement and the patent claims. They're the initial filter to see if the government actually has a real proprietary interest here.
Wow, okay, so that's one layer of specialized consultation. But the examiner needs a second layer too, right? For the procedural side of things.
Exactly. They also have to consult with the interference practice specialists, or the IPS, who are embedded within the USPTO's technology centers. This dual coordination is essential.
So the Office of Licensing and Review confirms the legal claim is plausible.
And the IPS provides the procedural blueprint, how to get the application structured and formally referred to the PT-TAVE for the contested case.
So what you're saying is that a regular examiner needs two layers of specialized high-level consultation, one on contract law and one on procedural litigation, just to figure out how to structure this case.
It absolutely shows how rare and high stakes these claims must be. The entire system, the dual consultation, the mandatory disclosure, the use of these interference-like procedures, it's a specialized track designed solely to manage these sensitive national interest innovations fairly and legally.
Okay, let's bring this all together for our listener. MPE 2309 may look like a tiny niche section, but it reinforces a profound principle that strategic federal objectives in space and energy come with explicit obligations that can, and often do, predetermine patent ownership.
Right. And the USPTO, through the PTO, has this specific, structured, and really rigorous process to enforce this. It's a powerful testament to government stewardship.
It seems like when federal resources are deployed for these critical national programs, the national interest just takes precedence.
It has to. The procedures we've discussed, the required statement, the internal coordination, the adversarial PTA framework, they all reinforce that inventor accountability is mandatory when you're working on these projects.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, it changes the inventor's role entirely. We touched on the idea that the government, as the obligated assignee, can just step in.
Yes. The rules clarify that while a person who is obligated to assign the invention can still file the application, the obligated assignee, the government in this case, may also file the application directly.
This raises a powerful final question for you to consider. When the government, having legally claimed title, steps into the shoes of the inventor to file, prosecute, and manage the patent, what new tensions arise? What about the inventor's continued involvement or, lack thereof in the process? This total transfer of control inherent in these federal contracts is the ultimate magnitude of the commitment inventors make. It's something for you to mull over.
That procedural reality really does underscore the magnitude. And to our listeners, just a reminder that this summary of the MPP was generated using AI tools and should not be considered legal advice. For authoritative guidance, please consult the official MPP or registered patent practitioner.
A special thank you to Mike Shepard for organizing this entire audio series. Until the next deep dive, keep learning.